Welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every case challenges your intellect, every clue sharpens your instincts, and every mystery pulls you deeper into the unknown. Grab a seat, stay sharp, and let's unravel the truth together. Sherlock Holmes and the clue he missed 20 years ago. Chapter 1. The Ghost of an Unsolved Case. London was drowning in rain that evening, the streets slick with water, the gas lamps casting their feeble glow against the storm's fury. I had just settled into my chair by the fire when a sharp, insistent knock sounded against the door of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, reclining with a distant gaze, seemed unbothered by the disturbance, but I saw something flicker in his expression, a quiet curiosity. I moved to answer it, opening the door to find a woman standing there, drenched from head to toe. She was frail, her hands trembling beneath the weight of a sodden cloak. Beneath the dim light of the corridor, I could see the pallor of her face, the way her eyes darted nervously before settling upon me with something between desperation and determination. "You must be Doctor Watson," she said, her voice quivering. I must speak with Mr. Holmes. It is a matter of grave importance." I ushered her in, helping her remove her soaked garments, while Holmes, ever the observer, studied her in silence. He had already pieced together fragments of her story before she uttered another word. "You are recently widowed, but not in mourning," he mused. "Your hands bear the faint traces of ink, yet you are no writer. A woman of means, yet one accustomed to distress. And if I may be so bold, you have come here not out of mere curiosity, but to awaken a ghost that should have long remained buried." The woman gasped softly, clutching the small leather bag at her side. "My name is Margaret Ashford," she whispered, "and I have come about the murder of my husband, a murder you failed to solve." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant roll of thunder. Holmes did not move, his face unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I watched him carefully. In all my years by his side, I had rarely seen a case unnerve him. And yet, at the mention of Margaret Ashford's name, his expression had shifted, subtly but enough. "I remember the case," Holmes said at last, his voice measured. "Reginald Ashford, found dead in his study, the door locked from the inside, a pistol near his hand." Margaret's grip on her bag tightened. "You ruled it a suicide, and you disagreed." "I knew my husband, Mr. Holmes. He was not a man who would take his own life." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, before gesturing toward the armchair opposite his. "Start from the beginning," he instructed. Margaret exhaled shakily, as if steadying herself. "It was 20 years ago," she began. "The night he died, we dined together as usual. He was uneasy, distracted. He retired to his study after supper, saying he had work to finish. When I went to check on him later that night, the door was locked. I knocked. There was no answer." Her voice faltered, her fingers tightening around the leather bag. "We forced the door open. He was slumped over his desk, a bullet wound to the temple. The pistol lay beside him. And yet, something was wrong. The room was too still, too arranged. It was as though someone had staged it." She turned her gaze toward Holmes, her eyes dark with something old and unresolved. "And now," she said softly, "I have proof that he was murdered." Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew a carefully folded scrap of paper. Even before she handed it to Holmes, I could see the age upon it, the yellowing of time, the edges softened by years of being handled. Holmes took it without a word, unfolding it with deliberate care. It was an old newspaper clipping, brittle beneath his fingertips. My eyes flicked over the bold headline, "Ashford Estate Tragedy. Prominent businessman takes his own life." I read the words, though I already knew them. I had been there, standing in the rain outside the Ashford estate all those years ago, watching as the authorities sealed the study where Reginald Ashford had met his untimely fate. But it was not the article itself that unsettled me. It was the small, jagged mark in the margin, a symbol, drawn in ink, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. Holmes stared at it, his expression unreadable. I knew that look. It was the look of a man recalling a detail from the past that had once seemed insignificant, but now burned with terrible importance. Margaret spoke barely above a whisper. I found this among my late husband's belongings, and I received a letter, an unsigned note, telling me that I should bring it to you, that you had made a mistake, Mr. Holmes. For the first time, Holmes looked away from the paper, his sharp gaze settling on Margaret. A mistake, he murmured, almost to himself. Then, with a flicker of something dark in his eyes, he whispered, "Impossible." Margaret hesitated before retrieving a second piece of paper from her bag. It was newer than the clipping, its ink still dark, the words scrawled in a hand unfamiliar to me. Holmes took it, his eyes scanning the brief message. As he read, I saw his fingers tighten ever so slightly on the page. "You were wrong, Mr. Holmes. The real killer was never found." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls of 221B Baker Street. Holmes said nothing at first, only rereading the note, his jaw set, his expression like stone. Watson, ever the voice of reason, spoke first. "It could be a cruel trick," he suggested. "Someone playing upon an old wound." Holmes exhaled slowly, then turned the note toward the light. "No," he murmured. "Whoever wrote this, they know something." Margaret's voice was strained. "Then you'll take the case? You'll help me prove that my husband was murdered?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and crossed the room to the bookshelf. Without hesitation, he pulled free a single volume, one of his old case files. I leaned forward, glimpsing the label. Ashford, Reginald, case closed. Slowly, deliberately, Holmes opened the file, his gaze settling on an old, faded piece of evidence within. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "I missed something, Watson." His fingers brushed over the brittle pages, lingering upon an old, overlooked detail. "And I fear," he added, almost to himself, "that it cost a man his life." The case was reopened, and the shadows of the past were stirring once more. The room was uncharacteristically silent. The usual rhythm of Holmes's deductions, delivered with effortless certainty, was absent. He sat motionless in his chair, the firelight flickering against the sharp planes of his face, but his expression was unreadable. I had known Sherlock Holmes for many years. I had seen him at his most brilliant, his most ruthless, and on rare occasions, his most human. But what I saw now unsettled me. An almost imperceptible hesitation, a shadow of something akin to doubt. Margaret Ashford sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed upon him. "You understand now, don't you?" she murmured. "You weren't meant to forget this case. Someone wanted you to." Holmes exhaled, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his chair. 20 years ago, I concluded this case with a finality I rarely afford any mystery," he said, his voice quiet. "But now, I must entertain a troubling thought, that I was led astray." I felt a chill creep over me. The notion that Sherlock Holmes, the man whose mind could untangle the most intricate of deceptions, had been wrong was almost unthinkable. Margaret leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then will you set it right?" Holmes did not answer immediately, but in the firelight, I saw his jaw tighten. And then, with the precision of a man about to reassemble the past, he reached for the bookshelf. Holmes's fingers moved over the rows of case files, each spine labelled in his meticulous hand. The collection was vast, a testament to his unrelenting pursuit of truth. But this time, he sought not triumph, but something forgotten. He withdrew a thin, dust-covered volume, its leather binding worn with age. Across the spine, in faded ink, was a name I had not seen in 2 decades. Ashford, Reginald, case closed. Holmes placed the file upon the table, his movements deliberate. He opened it with care, revealing yellowed documents, brittle with time. I watched as his gaze swept over the notes, his script as sharp and methodical then as it was now. "Here," he murmured, tapping his finger against a specific entry. "The official coroner's report. A single gunshot wound to the temple. No signs of struggle. Locked room scenario. Conclusion, suicide." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "And yet, you were wrong." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the report. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he flipped another page. A rough sketch of the crime scene emerged, complete with his original notations. And there, barely a footnote, was a detail he had dismissed. A small, missing object, one he had deemed inconsequential at the time. "Watson," he said, his voice tight. "Do you remember this?" I leaned over the file, frowning. It was a brief mention, buried beneath more pressing observations. But now, in the wake of Margaret's revelations, it stood out like a flaw in an otherwise perfect tapestry. An ivory chess piece. My stomach tightened. "You noted it was absent from the study when the body was discovered." Holmes nodded. "And I failed to ask why." He turned to Margaret. "You said you found this newspaper clipping among your husband's belongings. But tell me, was there anything else? Anything that seemed out of place?" She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Yes, a pawn. A single white pawn." I assumed it was nothing. Holmes's fingers tightened over the edges of the file. "No, Mrs. Ashford, it was everything." The fire crackled, filling the silence that stretched between us. Holmes sat rigid in his chair, his gaze unfocused, lost in the corridors of memory. I had seen him solve the most elaborate of crimes with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But now I saw something else, a weight pressing upon him, one I had rarely seen him bear. Finally he spoke. "I missed something, Watson." His voice was low, almost reluctant, and I fear it cost a man his life. A lump formed in my throat. Holmes was not a man who entertained regret. He was ruthless in logic, unwavering in reason. But something about this case had unsettled him in a way I could not quite grasp. Margaret's breath hitched. "Then, you believe me?" Holmes looked at her, and for the first time that evening, I saw something resembling contrition in his expression. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford, I do." She exhaled sharply, as though years of weight had suddenly lifted from her chest. Holmes turned back to the file, his fingers brushing over the old ink, the case notes he had once considered complete. Then, in a swift motion, he closed the folder. "We begin again." His voice had lost its hesitation. The fire in his eyes had returned. Watson, still shaken by the admission, found himself gripping the armrest of his chair. "And where do we start?" Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Where all good mysteries do, my dear Watson, at the scene of the crime." Chapter 2. Revisiting the shadows of the past. The rain had ceased by the time we departed Baker Street, but a heavy mist lingered over the streets, rolling in from the Thames like a silent spectre. Holmes sat beside me in the cab, his face composed but his fingers betraying his thoughts, tapping an erratic rhythm against the handle of his cane. I had known him to be restless in the wake of a fresh puzzle, but tonight there was something different about his manner. It was not the excitement of a new case that preoccupied him, but the weight of an old one, a case that, for the first time in my recollection, he had failed to close. "We shall reach the Ashford estate by midnight," he murmured, half to himself. "A fitting hour for the exhumation of ghosts." Margaret Ashford sat across from us, wrapped in her mourning cloak, though she had long since ceased to grieve in the conventional sense. Instead, she carried a quiet determination, her hands clutching a small bundle of letters, fragments of a life abruptly severed. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Even then, You must have suspected. Holmes turned his gaze upon her, his expression unreadable. Suspicions are the currency of a detective, Mrs. Ashford, but it is proof that buys justice. Outside, the mist thickened, shrouding the road ahead in a veil of uncertainty. The Ashford estate awaited us beyond the fog, untouched for 20 years. And within its walls, the past still lingered. The iron gates groaned in protest as we pushed them open. Before us, the great Ashford estate loomed against the night, a skeletal silhouette against the dim moonlight, its once proud facade weathered by time and neglect. Margaret hesitated upon the threshold, her breath shallow. "It hasn't changed," she murmured, "not in 20 years." The gravel crunched beneath our boots as we ascended the stone steps, our lanterns casting long shadows against the walls. Holmes said nothing, his keen gaze sweeping over the entrance, taking in the overgrown ivy, the boarded-up windows, the faint scent of damp wood and decay. The door yielded beneath Margaret's touch. A breath of cold air escaped the house, carrying with it the stale perfume of a past left undisturbed. Inside, the silence was near absolute. Furniture sat draped beneath dust-laden sheets, and the grand chandelier above the foyer hung in solemn stillness. Footsteps echoed as we moved deeper, passing rooms where clocks had long since stopped, and paintings stared from their frames with hollowed eyes. It was as though the house itself had been waiting, preserved in the very moment that tragedy had struck, unwilling to move forward. "His study is this way," Margaret whispered. Holmes cast a glance at me, and I saw it again, that fleeting shadow of something almost human beneath his usual detachment. A case long closed had been reopened, and Holmes was about to step back into the past. The study was precisely as it had been described in the reports. The desk, the bookshelves, the heavy drapes drawn over the tall windows. The chair where Reginald Ashford had been found, slumped over his desk, a bullet wound at his temple. Margaret stepped forward, her gloved fingers brushing over the wood. "I remember the night so clearly," she murmured. "I heard him pacing after dinner. He had been restless for days, muttering about something he could not put right." She turned toward Holmes, her eyes sharp beneath the veil. And then suddenly, there was silence. I could almost see it. The frozen moment when she had knocked upon the door, her voice wavering as she called his name. The stillness, the dreadful realization that something was wrong. "The door was locked," she continued. "We forced it open. He was already gone." Holmes moved toward the desk, running his fingers over its surface. "You always believed it was murder." Margaret's voice hardened. "Because it was." Her hands clenched at her sides. "But you were so certain, Mr. Holmes, so quick to declare it as suicide. You dismissed my doubts. You—" She exhaled, steadying herself. "You were wrong." Holmes remained still, his eyes fixed on the empty chair where Reginald Ashford had spent his final moments. And then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "Perhaps I was." I turned to Holmes in surprise. Never had I heard such words from him, not in jest, nor in earnest. Sherlock Holmes, the man who prided himself on his infallibility, now stood within the very room where he had once declared his verdict, and questioned himself. "It was a closed-room case," he murmured, more to himself than to us. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance, the pistol in his hand. All logical deductions led to one conclusion. Margaret stepped closer. "And yet, you missed something." Holmes did not react, but I saw his fingers tighten against the edge of the desk. I had always known him to be unshakable, a fortress of reason against the irrationalities of the world. But now, standing in the very space where he had once pronounced judgment, I saw something different. Doubt. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. And if Sherlock Holmes could doubt himself, then what truth lay buried beneath this house's silence? Holmes turned abruptly, his gaze sharp once more. "If I was wrong," he said, his voice regaining its steel, Then the evidence must still be here. He looked to me, his eyes clear, his mind now fully engaged. We begin again, Watson, and this time we do not leave a single stone unturned. The study was precisely as it had been described in the official reports, an elegant yet somber room, lined with towering bookshelves and a grand mahogany desk at its heart. Dust lay thick upon the surfaces, disturbed only by the prints left by Margaret's hesitant steps. Holmes moved with quiet deliberation, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. His fingers ran along the edges of the desk, brushing over the faint indentations left by years of habitual writing. "Everything here tells a story, Watson," he murmured. "The question is, what has been rewritten?" Margaret lingered at the doorway, her gaze locked upon the chair where her husband had been found. "He was sitting there when they found him," she whispered, "the door locked from the inside, the pistol beside him. And yet, I knew." Holmes crouched beside the desk, his expression darkening. "And yet, you knew it was a lie," he finished. "As should I have." I stepped forward, following his gaze. The lock on the study door was scratched, subtly, but unmistakably tampered with. It had been broken open before, and then, perhaps, locked again from the inside to conceal the truth. Holmes straightened, his fingers lingering against the bookshelves. He plucked a volume from its place, flipping through the pages before stopping abruptly. A thin layer of dust clung to most of the books, but one spot, where a book had once rested, was immaculate. "Something was taken from here," he muttered. "Something important." And then, with a flicker of something dark in his gaze, he whispered, "The game was played, Watson. And we were not the ones moving the pieces." Holmes reached into the open space on the bookshelf, running his fingers along the empty void. His eyes narrowed. "A missing book," he said, half to himself. "And not just any book, one removed with purpose." Margaret's breath hitched. "There was something else," she admitted, "among his things, after he died. A chess piece, a single white pawn. I never understood why he kept it." Holmes turned sharply. "A pawn, you say?" She nodded, withdrawing a small cloth pouch from her coat. With great care, she emptied its contents into her palm. A single ivory pawn, its surface worn smooth by time. Holmes took it between his fingers, turning it over. "Not merely a keepsake," he murmured. "A message, a warning." I watched as his mind worked at lightning speed, piecing together a puzzle I could not yet see. "A pawn is the most unassuming piece in the game," he continued, "expendable, overlooked, and yet." He turned the piece in the light, revealing a faint inscription etched along its base, so small it was nearly invisible. He read it aloud, his voice low. "One move was all it took." Margaret paled. "What does it mean?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "It means, Mrs. Ashford," he said, "that your husband did not lose this game. He was sacrificed." A rustle at the doorway made us turn. A figure stood there, a man, old and bent with age, his thin hands wringing at his coat. His name was Edgar Pike, a once trusted servant of the Ashford household. He had been the one to find Reginald Ashford's body all those years ago. "You have returned," he rasped. "After all these years." Holmes regarded him coolly. "It appears I must." The old man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the chess piece in Holmes's hand. "I told you everything then, sir," he muttered. "There's nothing more I can say." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something sharp and unforgiving. "You were the first to enter this study after the death, were you not?" I was," Pike stammered. "I found the door locked, same as the others. We had to force it open." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet the lock shows outward damage, meaning it was broken into before the body was found, not after." Pike's lips parted, but no words came. "You knew," Holmes murmured. "You knew the truth, and yet you remained silent. The question is, why?" The old man trembled, his face lined with the weight of 2 decades of secrecy. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed, "Because I was told to." The room fell deathly silent. Holmes's eyes darkened. "Who told you, Pike?" The old man swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward Margaret before dropping to the floor. I cannot say." Holmes sighed, his voice a blade's edge. "Then I fear, Mr. Pike, that your silence will no longer serve you." At that moment, the air shifted. A sound, subtle, deliberate, echoed from above. A footstep, then another. Watson tensed beside me. "Holmes, this house was supposed to be abandoned." Holmes had already moved, his focus sharp as a dagger. "Indeed, Watson. And yet it appears we are not alone." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath shallow. Who could it be?" Holmes raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. We listened. The steps were careful, deliberate. Not the careless wandering of an intruder, but the measured tread of someone who did not wish to be heard. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Someone," he murmured, "has been waiting for us." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "And what do you propose we do?" Holmes turned toward me, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "Why, Watson," he whispered, "we oblige them." Chapter 3. The Living and the Dead. The house had been silent for so long that the sound of the footsteps above us felt almost unreal, an echo from another time. Holmes did not hesitate. His keen eyes flickered toward the ceiling, his body already poised for pursuit. "Watson," he murmured, his voice taut with anticipation, "it would appear we have company." Margaret gasped, clutching the folds of her cloak. But who could—" Holmes raised a gloved hand, silencing her. Another step, deliberate, measured. Someone was there, moving in the attic above. Holmes had already crossed the room. He pressed his palm against the wall, feeling for vibrations, mapping the movements of the intruder. Then, with one swift motion, he produced his revolver. "Stay behind me," he commanded. The air was thick with dust as we ascended the narrow staircase. The boards beneath our feet groaned in protest, betraying our presence. Holmes reached the attic door first, his fingers curling around the rusted handle. He pushed it open. The lantern's glow flickered across the space, illuminating a gaunt figure crouched against the far wall, his face partially obscured by shadow. His clothes were threadbare, his hands calloused and dirt-streaked. Yet there was something else, a stillness about him, as though he had been expecting us. Holmes took a step forward, his revolver steady. "You have been hiding here for some time," he observed. "You were waiting, weren't you?" The figure stirred. A dry, rasping voice broke the silence. "I knew you would come back, Mr. Holmes." And as he stepped into the light, I recognized him. Tobias Rigg. The name Tobias Rigg was not unfamiliar to me, nor to the pages of the old case files Holmes had reviewed before our return to Ashford Manor. He had once been a prime suspect, a thief with a penchant for burglary, a man known to frequent the shadows of London's underworld. But the evidence against him had been circumstantial, and he had vanished before he could be questioned. Now, 2 decades later, he stood before us once more. Holmes lowered his revolver slightly, though his sharp gaze did not waver. "You were here the night Reginald Ashford was murdered." Rigg exhaled a dry chuckle. "Aye," he admitted. "But not in the way you think, Mr. Holmes." Margaret stiffened beside me. You knew my husband." Rigg's gaze flickered toward her, a shadow of something unreadable crossing his features. "I knew of him," he said, his voice hoarse. "And I know what happened that night." Holmes folded his arms. "Then you will tell us." The old thief hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. "You wouldn't believe me if I did." Holmes took a step closer. "Try me." Rigg swallowed. His sunken eyes darted around the attic, as if fearing unseen ears in the darkness. Then, finally, he spoke. "I didn't kill him," he said, "but I did take something from his study that night." Holmes did not move, his expression impassive. "Go on," he urged. Rigg ran a trembling hand through his unkempt hair. "It was never supposed to be like this," he muttered. "I came that night to steal, not to kill. I knew Ashford kept valuables, small things, easy to take. So, I waited until I was sure he was alone." Margaret let out a quiet gasp. I glanced at her, noting the way her fingers tightened around her cloak. Rigg continued. "I slipped in through the side entrance. The house was dark, silent. I made my way to the study, but when I got there, he was already dead." A shiver crawled down my spine. "And you ran?" Rigg let out a humorless laugh. "Wouldn't you? A dead man in a locked room. No witnesses? What do you think happens to a man like me when the police come sniffing around?" Holmes studied him, his fingers steepled. "You took something," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. Rigg nodded slowly. "A chess piece," he admitted. "An ivory pawn. It was lying there on the floor, near the body. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I thought it was worth something." Holmes's eyes darkened. "And where is it now?" Rigg hesitated. "I lost it." Margaret gasped. Holmes, however, simply nodded, as though he had expected such an answer. "Watson," he said, turning to me, "I do believe we have found our missing piece." I had seen Sherlock Holmes stare down criminals with the cold resolve of a man utterly assured of his own superiority. I had watched him dismantle the most intricate of puzzles with a confidence bordering on arrogance. But that night, as we stood in the decayed remnants of Reginald Ashford's study, I saw something I had never seen before. Doubt. Holmes had not moved since Tobias Rigg's confession. His eyes, sharp as ever, remained fixed upon the floorboards, as though he were seeing something the rest of us could not. His fingers tapped against his forearm, a rare sign of agitation. "You are troubled, Holmes," I ventured. His lips pressed into a thin line. "It is not often, Watson, that I find myself confronted with the spectre of my own fallibility." Margaret Ashford watched him carefully. "You were wrong," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. Holmes did not refute her. "It would appear so," he murmured. I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest. This was not merely a case to Holmes anymore, it was something more, and that was what unsettled me most of all. Then, with a sudden exhale, Holmes straightened. The hesitation vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper. "Doubt is a luxury we can ill afford," he said. "We are not here to grieve my past errors. We are here to correct them." And with that, he moved to the desk, his fingers ghosting over its surface. "Watson, help me," he ordered. "Somewhere in this room, the truth is waiting to be found." Holmes began methodically sifting through the study's contents, his movements calculated and precise. I joined him, though the air in the room felt heavier now, as though the past itself was pressing down upon us. It was Holmes who found the first clue. He held up a stack of letters, bound together with twine. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but as he thumbed through them, his brows knitted together. "Correspondences," he murmured. "Personal, business, and something else." I moved to his side, peering over his shoulder as he separated a particular set of letters. One's written in a different hand, signed only with the initial V. Margaret inhaled sharply. Those were not among his things before. Holmes flipped to the last page of one, his eyes darkening as he read. "You play a dangerous game, Ashford. Walk away now, before you are made to fall." A chill passed through me. "Holmes, this is not the language of a business rival. This is a threat." Holmes nodded. "And not an idle one. Reginald Ashford did not take his own life, Watson. He was forced into checkmate. He turned to Margaret. Did your husband speak of enemies? Business dealings beyond the usual? She hesitated, then shook her head. No. Or if he did, he kept them from me. Holmes exhaled. Then we must assume he was in deeper than even you knew. His fingers hovered over the letters once more. Then, suddenly, he straightened. There is something else, something hidden. His gaze darted toward the bookshelves. Without another word, he strode forward, reaching for a particular volume with a slight bulge along its spine. And as he pulled it free, the past came tumbling into the present. The book in Holmes's hands was old, older than the others, its spine cracked from years of handling. He turned it over with the precision of a man dismantling a puzzle, feeling for irregularities. Then, without hesitation, he pried open the back cover. A small folded slip of paper had been tucked within. Holmes withdrew it carefully, his fingers brushing away the fine layer of dust that had settled over the years. His expression remained unreadable as he unfolded it. But when he read the words, his jaw tightened. I stepped closer. Holmes? He did not answer at once. His eyes scanned the page again, as if hoping the words would change. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It is a message, Watson." Margaret swallowed. From whom? Holmes met my gaze, his own unreadable. From a dead man. And then he turned the paper toward me. The ink had faded, the script trembling as though written in haste, but the words were still legible. You were always meant to die that night. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I felt my stomach tighten. Holmes, I breathed. What in God's name does that mean? Holmes did not reply. His gaze was fixed upon the note, his mind undoubtedly racing through every possible implication. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the paper. "It's his writing," she whispered. This is Reginald's hand." She looked up at Holmes, her eyes wide with something close to fear. "He knew," she said. "He knew he was going to die." Holmes finally spoke, his voice measured. "Not just that, Mrs. Ashford. He accepted it." A cold realization settled over me. "You think he saw his death as inevitable?" Holmes exhaled. "Or worse, that he played a role in ensuring it." Margaret shook her head violently. No, he wouldn't." Holmes regarded her with something almost like pity. "Then the only alternative," he said softly, "is that someone else ensured it for him." I felt a chill creep into my bones. "Who, Holmes?" He turned back to the letters, his eyes distant. "That," he murmured, "is what we must uncover." He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his coat. "We have awakened something, Watson," he said, "and I fear it will not go quietly." Outside, the wind howled through the crumbling estate, rattling the glass as though something unseen had been stirred. And in that moment, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. Chapter 4. The Mastermind in the Shadows. Holmes stood in the centre of the study, his eyes half-lidded in thought, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. The dim light of the lantern cast elongated shadows against the bookshelves, painting the room in shades of memory. "It was never suicide," he murmured at last. Margaret Ashford stiffened beside me, her breath catching. Then he was murdered." Holmes exhaled, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room. "Murder, certainly, but not in the manner we first believed. We must strip away the deception, Watson, reconstruct the moment as it truly occurred." He stepped toward the desk, gesturing toward the heavy chair that still sat where Reginald Ashford had once slumped, lifeless. "The official report stated that Ashford took his own life with a single gunshot to the temple," Holmes continued, "and yet the evidence suggests otherwise." He turned sharply, pointing to the door. "For one, the lock. It was forced open before the discovery of the body, not after. A contradiction ignored by those too willing to accept the obvious." His hand swept over the desk, his fingers pausing on a faint indentation in the wood. And here, a depression on the surface. The missing book, a crucial detail I foolishly dismissed. Holmes straightened, his voice cool and clipped. Ashford was made to write a final message before his death. He was seated here, forced to play his part. And when the deed was done, his body was arranged to sell the illusion. Margaret's voice was scarcely above a whisper. But why? Holmes turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Because, Mrs. Ashford, your husband was never meant to leave this study alive. I watched as Holmes retrieved the stack of old correspondences from the desk, his keen gaze flicking over each letter with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Patterns, Watson, he murmured. The criminal mind is often mistaken for chaotic, but it is nothing of the sort. It thrives on structure, on repetition. And within that repetition, we find the truth. He separated several letters from the pile, laying them out before us. Observe, if you will, the recipients of these messages. Here, a banker. Here, a solicitor. And here, his voice dipped slightly, a police inspector. Margaret inhaled sharply. My husband wrote to all of them. Holmes nodded. And more than once, he was inquiring, probing, searching for something. I frowned, scanning the documents. But what was the connection between them? Holmes tapped the letters lightly. It is not they who are connected, Watson. It is to whom they answered. He looked up then, his grey eyes gleaming with something dark and knowing. Reginald Ashford was seeking answers about a single man. A man whose name was never written, but whose influence is felt in every word. Margaret swallowed. Who? Holmes turned the final letter toward her. A name that lingers in the shadows of London's underworld. He leaned forward, his voice a whisper. Victor Henshaw. Margaret paled at the name, clutching at the folds of her dress as though steadying herself. I know that name, she whispered. Reginald spoke it once, only once, and I could hear the fear in his voice. Holmes nodded. As well he should. Henshaw is not a man one speaks of lightly. I frowned. I have heard it before. Whispers in the papers, rumours in the courts. But his face. No one has ever seen it. Holmes allowed himself a humourless smile. And yet, he sees everything. Henshaw is a spectre in the city, his influence stretching from the slums of Whitechapel to the halls of Parliament itself. The powerful seek his favour, the desperate owe him their lives. He turned back to the letters. Your husband discovered something, Mrs. Ashford, something that placed him squarely in Henshaw's path. And for that, he was eliminated. Margaret's breath was shaky. But if no one has seen him, how do we find him? Holmes tapped a single page. We follow the trail of those he has touched. Every king has his pawns, and Henshaw's are everywhere. He straightened, his gaze sharpening. But even a man in the shadows can be forced into the light. And that is precisely what I intend to do. The study had grown colder, as though the weight of revelation had stolen the very warmth from the air. Margaret sat in silence, her hands clasped before her, her mind no doubt racing through the horrors Holmes had unearthed. I turned to him. Holmes, if Henshaw ordered Ashford's death, what was the motive? What was he trying to suppress? Holmes exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the desk. That is the final question, Watson. But tell me, what is the nature of a game left unfinished? I hesitated. One that must be played again. Holmes gave a thin smile. Precisely. He gestured to the letters. Ashford was only one player in Henshaw's game, and if I am correct, his role was not one of victory, but sacrifice, which means, my breath caught, which means someone else is next. Holmes nodded. Henshaw has moved his pieces. It is time we moved ours. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Ashford, I need one final favour. She swallowed hard. Anything. Holmes's gaze was sharp. Your husband was silenced for what he knew. But if word were to spread that his secrets had not died with him, if, say, an investigator had uncovered new evidence. Margaret's eyes widened. You mean to provoke them? Holmes inclined his head. Not just provoke, Mrs. Ashford, force their hand. A sense of foreboding settled over me. Holmes, this is dangerous. Holmes smiled faintly. All the best games are, Watson. Holmes was never more dangerous than when he was at his most still. He stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the gaslit streets below with an air of quiet calculation. The firelight flickered behind him, casting his silhouette against the curtains, his mind already 3 steps ahead of the unseen enemy. The moment we expose a rat's hiding place, Watson, we must expect it to flee or fight, he murmured. And in this case, I would wager our adversary will choose the latter. I watched as he turned to the desk, where a freshly written letter lay upon the polished wood. It bore the official stamp of Scotland Yard, though I knew well enough that its contents were pure fabrication. I have informed the press, Holmes continued. Tomorrow morning, the city will awaken to the news that I have uncovered irrefutable proof that Reginald Ashford did not take his own life. I frowned. But that is not yet true, Holmes. We have suspicions, theories, but no solid evidence. He smiled faintly. Precisely. But our unknown adversary does not know that. He will see only the headline, and he will panic. Margaret Ashford, seated across from us, pressed a hand to her lips. You are forcing him into the open, she whispered. Holmes nodded. If he believes that the noose is tightening, he will act. And when he does, his fingers tapped against the desk, I shall be waiting. Night had fallen over London, wrapping the city in its familiar shroud of mist and shadow. The streets outside Baker Street had quieted, save for the occasional rattle of a carriage or the distant tolling of a clock tower. Holmes sat in his chair, unmoving, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting only the faintest glow upon his sharp features. He had spoken little since our conversation with Margaret Ashford, his mind no doubt preoccupied with the inevitable response to his provocation. I could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. Holmes, I said at last, do you truly believe he will act so soon? He did not look at me, only exhaled softly. Desperation breeds recklessness, Watson. Our adversary is not a man accustomed to being hunted. He will strike because he must. The silence between us grew heavier. Even the walls of 221B seemed to listen, holding their breath. I rose, moving toward the window, peering down at the street below. Nothing seemed out of place. No lingering figures in the fog, no unusual movements in the lamplight. And yet, an inexplicable dread coiled in my gut. Something was coming, and Holmes knew it. The first sound came in the dead of night, a noise so faint that I might have ignored it, had my mind not been restless. A soft, deliberate creak, as though a weight had been shifted upon the floorboards. I sat up at once, my pulse quickening. The fire had burned down to embers, the room thick with shadows. For a long moment I listened. Then, another sound. A faint rustling from the direction of Holmes's chamber. I was out of bed in an instant, my feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor as I moved toward his door. The handle was cold beneath my fingers as I turned it, only to find the room empty. The window was open. A sharp gust of wind carried in the scent of damp cobblestones, the curtains billowing like silent sentinels. Holmes's chair was pushed back slightly from the desk, as though he had risen abruptly. His coat was missing from the stand. A terrible realization gripped me. He had gone. Heart pounding, I rushed to the window, peering out into the fog-laden streets below. But there was nothing. Only the hollow glow of the gas lamps, the occasional distant shape moving through the mist. Holmes, I breathed. I knew him too well. He had anticipated danger, but he had chosen to meet it alone. I turned sharply, throwing on my coat, my revolver heavy in my pocket. If Holmes had walked willingly into the jaws of the beast, then by God I would follow. Chapter 5. A Dead Man's Move. I awoke to the distant chime of a clock tower, its solemn toll marking the hour of 3. The fire in my room had burned to embers, the cold settling into the bones of Baker Street like an unwelcome guest. At first, I thought it had been a dream, the sensation that something was amiss. Then I saw it, a single envelope, stark against the wooden floor. Someone had slipped it beneath the door. I rose at once, my heart pounding as I reached for it. The paper was thick, the edges crisp, as though handled with careful deliberation. No name adorned the front, only a wax seal, its imprint unmistakable. A black king chess piece. With growing unease, I tore it open, my fingers shaking as I unfolded the note within. The message was short, but its meaning was chilling. If Holmes values the truth, let him come alone. The game is not over. V.H. Victor Henshaw. A sickening dread coiled in my gut. The man who had orchestrated Reginald Ashford's death, the man who had lurked in the shadows of this case from the very beginning, had finally stepped forward. Holmes had set the trap, and now the hunter had become the hunted. I turned toward his room, pushing open the door without hesitation. "Holmes!" I called. But he was already awake, sitting at the edge of his chair, the dim glow of the gas lamp illuminating his sharp, calculating expression. He had been expecting this. Holmes read the letter in silence. His face betrayed nothing, save for the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps. "He took the bait," he murmured, "and now he calls for the endgame." I clenched my fists. "Then I'm coming with you." Holmes exhaled softly, folding the letter with careful precision. "No, Watson. That would be unwise." I felt a surge of frustration. Unwise? "Holmes, you are walking into a trap." He met my gaze then, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I walk into every trap, Watson. The difference is, I know the rules of the game." I stepped forward. "And what if this is the one time you miscalculate?" For a moment, he did not answer. Then, with the faintest ghost of a smile, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then I shall rely on my most trusted piece to tip the board." I shook my head, my throat tight with anger. "I won't let you go alone." Holmes sighed. "And yet you will." He turned toward the window, the fog beyond swallowing the city in its merciless embrace. "Stay here, Watson. Watch, listen. And if the night grows too silent, you will know when to act." I knew there was no arguing with him. And so, with a final glance back at me, Holmes stepped into the mist. London was a different creature at night. The streets, once alive with the restless murmur of the city, had grown still, the gas lamps casting weak halos against the encroaching fog. Holmes moved swiftly, his footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. He had left Baker Street without a word to Mrs. Hudson, without a glance back. His mind was elsewhere, in the game. Every step was calculated, every shadow considered. He had met men like Victor Henshaw before, ghosts who walked among the living, who built their empires not on steel or stone, but on whispers and fear. Yet Henshaw had made a mistake. He had revealed himself. Holmes turned a corner, the distant scent of the Thames heavy in the air. He had memorized the layout of the dockyard before even receiving the letter. There were 3 possible vantage points for an ambush, 2 concealed entryways, and only one route of escape. The odds were acceptable. His fingers brushed against the revolver in his coat. He rarely relied on such methods, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was not only solving a crime. Tonight, he was making his move. The mist thickened as he neared the river, the wooden planks of the docks groaning under unseen weight. Somewhere in the darkness, a clock struck 4. And then, from the shadows, a voice. "You came." Holmes did not stop. He simply smiled. As if there was ever any doubt. Victor Henshaw stood with the ease of a man who had never once feared consequence. The gas lamps cast long shadows against the rotting wood of the dock, his form barely distinguishable from the mist that curled around him. He was tall, lean, dressed in a coat too fine for the filth of the dockyard, but it was not his attire that unsettled. It was his eyes. They were dark, knowing. Holmes took a measured step forward. "You orchestrated the perfect crime," he said lightly. "Reginald Ashford's death was neither a robbery nor an act of passion. It was a piece in a game only you understood." Henshaw's lips curled into something resembling amusement. "And yet, here you are, trying to understand it." Holmes inclined his head. "Tell me, did you expect me to uncover it? Or was I merely an inconvenience?" Henshaw chuckled. Inconveniences can be corrected. A faint shift in the mist behind Holmes. A presence. A second figure. Holmes did not turn. He merely smiled. "Ah, and here I thought you'd at least play the game fairly." Henshaw's voice dropped to a whisper. "The game was never fair, Mr. Holmes." The revolver clicked. Holmes's mind sharpened. He had anticipated this. And the real move, the final move, was already in play. Victor Henshaw stood at the edge of the dock, the mist curling around him like a living thing. The water beyond was black and still, the city's gaslights barely touching its surface. He exuded confidence, a man who had never been caught, never been outplayed. Holmes met his gaze unflinching. "You ensured that every piece was placed before the game had even begun," he said coolly. Henshaw smiled. "Of course. A good player doesn't react, Mr. Holmes. He orchestrates." His voice carried the casual arrogance of a man who had spent a lifetime pulling strings from the shadows. "It was all so very simple. The witnesses, paid handsomely. The evidence, planted where it needed to be. The police, well, they see what they are told to see." He studied Holmes with something close to amusement. "And you, the great detective, fell for it." Holmes remained still, his gaze unreadable. "Not quite," he murmured. Henshaw chuckled. "Oh, but you did. You thought this was about money, about power. But Ashford's death, that was never mine to command." A chill ran through me. "Then whose was it?" Henshaw's smile widened. "You already know, Dr. Watson." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You simply don't want to say it." Holmes exhaled softly. "Ah," he said, "so the final piece falls into place." He turned toward me, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "The true killer was never Victor Henshaw. It was Reginald Ashford's own brother." Margaret Ashford had spoken of him only briefly. Samuel Ashford, the forgotten younger brother, the one who had never been suspected because he had never been considered. A man who had lived in the shadow of his elder sibling, bound by blood but divided by ambition. Holmes's voice was smooth, precise. Samuel had the most to lose, did he not? Reginald Ashford was preparing to expose corruption within his family. Their legacy was built upon deception, their wealth upon ruin. Samuel could not allow his brother's conscience to dismantle everything they had built. Henshaw's smirk did not fade. "You see, you waste your time with men like me, Holmes. I do not kill, I merely facilitate." Samuel needed a solution. I provided one. I clenched my fists. "You arranged everything, made sure the crime looked like a suicide." Henshaw shrugged. "Ashford was already dead the moment he decided to turn against his family. I simply ensured the story had a more convenient ending." Holmes sighed, his expression unreadable. "And what of Samuel Ashford?" Henshaw's smile did not waver. "Oh, I imagine he is halfway to the continent by now. After all, he had 20 years to prepare." The words chilled me. Could it be true? Had the real murderer slipped away beyond our reach? Holmes inhaled sharply. "Perhaps. But even ghosts leave footprints, Henshaw, and Samuel Ashford will make a mistake, Sooner or later. Henshaw chuckled. That I'd like to see. Then, in a flash, his hand moved. The glint of steel caught the lantern light. Henshaw's fingers curled around the revolver at his waist, the movement practiced, swift. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only the cold certainty of a man who had killed before, and would do so again. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. Holmes! Holmes did not move. His voice was as calm as ever. You won't fire, Henshaw. The villain's smirk twitched. And why is that? Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. Because you are not alone in the dark. A shadow shifted behind the crates. The dull click of a revolver being cocked cut through the night. Henshaw's confidence wavered. From the mist, a voice rang out, firm, authoritative. Drop the weapon, Inspector Lestrade. Holmes sighed almost wearily. Really, Victor, you didn't think I came unprepared, did you? Henshaw's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched as though weighing the odds. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. And with that, the trap was sprung. The night air was thick with tension as Scotland Yard emerged from the shadows, their presence like the closing of an iron cage. Henshaw did not struggle as Lestrade stepped forward, binding his wrists with practiced efficiency. I must say, Lestrade muttered, you certainly took your time, Holmes. Holmes dusted off his coat. I find that the best performances require proper staging, Inspector. Henshaw turned to face Holmes, his expression unreadable. You think you've won, he murmured. But men like me, we never truly lose. Holmes met his gaze with unsettling composure. No, Henshaw. You lost the moment you stepped into the light. The villain let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. We shall see. And then, as the constables dragged him toward the waiting carriage, the great Victor Henshaw, the man who had orchestrated so much from the shadows, was swallowed by them at last. Yet Holmes did not smile. His eyes remained fixed on the mist curling over the river, his thoughts already elsewhere. There was no triumph in his face, only contemplation. We left the dock in silence. The Thames stretched before us, vast and unknowable, the city's lights flickering against its shifting surface. I glanced at Holmes, searching for some sign of satisfaction, some flicker of victory. I found none. You did it, I said at last. Henshaw is finished. The case is closed. Holmes exhaled, his breath a ghost in the cold air. Is it? I frowned. Samuel Ashford may have escaped, but we have the truth. That is something. Holmes did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon, as though watching the final pieces settle on an invisible chessboard. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, The game was played, Watson, but the pieces were never ours to move. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time that night, I understood. Henshaw was not the true mastermind. He was merely another player. And Samuel Ashford, the man who had gained the most, who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, remained free. The real game was still being played, and somewhere, out in the darkness of London, another move was already being made. Holmes turned away from the river, his coat billowing in the wind. Come, Watson, he said softly. This is far from over. And with that, we stepped into the fog once more. Chapter 6. The Haunting Resolution. The streets of London stretched before us, shrouded in mist, the gaslights flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The case was over. Victor Henshaw was in chains, his empire of deceit crumbling beneath the weight of its own corruption. Scotland Yard would hail the resolution as a triumph, a testament to their diligence. Yet beside me, Sherlock Holmes remained silent. We walked in step, but I could feel the distance between us. An absence, a hesitation. His features were unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the present, beyond the satisfaction of victory. I studied him carefully. You should be pleased, Holmes. Henshaw will never manipulate another soul again. Holmes exhaled softly, almost absently. Should I? His response was quiet, yet something in his tone unsettled me. I frowned. The game is over. We won. He stopped walking then, turning to face me. His expression was not one of triumph, nor even relief. It was something else entirely. An unease, a question left unanswered. Holmes glanced toward the swirling fog of the Thames, his voice barely above a whisper. Then why does it feel as though we lost? Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze distant. The crackling fire cast long shadows against the walls, flickering like the ghost of a thought that refused to be laid to rest. I watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you have the look of a man who is still waiting for an answer." His eyes flickered toward me, sharp and piercing. "Because I am, Watson." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "Everything fits. Every move accounted for, every piece of the puzzle aligned. And yet—" He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his tone. "There is something I have failed to see." I frowned. Henshaw confessed to orchestrating the cover-up. Samuel Ashford remains in hiding, but we both know his time will come. What else is there? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder on the table, flipping it open to the case notes. His eyes scanned the words, searching. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "The chess piece." I blinked. "What?" Holmes' voice was low, almost to himself. "The ivory chess piece. The one Tobias Rigg stole from Ashford's study 20 years ago. It vanished, lost to time. And yet, I cannot shake the feeling that it was never just a trinket." I hesitated. "Holmes, you aren't suggesting—" A sudden knock at the door cut through the room. Holmes's eyes met mine. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew. The game was not over. Mrs. Hudson had barely opened the door before Tobias Rigg stumbled inside. He looked older than when we had last seen him. His gaunt face paler, his weary eyes darker. He clutched something in his hand, something wrapped in cloth, as though its weight burned his fingers. Holmes remained motionless, watching him with unsettling stillness. "You came back," Holmes murmured. Rigg exhaled sharply, running a trembling hand through his unkempt hair. "I should have left London," he muttered. "I should have thrown this into the Thames and forgotten I ever saw it." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing the single, time-worn ivory chess piece. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Holmes did not blink. "Where did you find it?" Rigg hesitated. "It wasn't lost," he said, his voice raw. "It was hidden." Holmes slowly reached for the piece, turning it in his fingers, his gaze unreadable. Then, with a quiet intensity, he murmured, "And now, the final move is revealed." Holmes sat motionless in his chair, the ivory chess piece resting between his fingers, turning ever so slightly as he examined it beneath the dim glow of the gaslight. "A chess piece," he murmured. "A token of strategy, a relic of calculated moves." His thumb brushed the surface, feeling for imperfections. And yet, this one hides something more. With careful precision, he retrieved his penknife and pressed the tip against an almost imperceptible seam. A gentle twist, a faint click, and the piece split apart. Inside, nestled within the hollowed-out cavity, was a tiny slip of paper. A note, aged and yellowed with time, folded so tightly that it had remained undisturbed for 2 decades. My breath caught as Holmes unfurled it with delicate fingers. The ink had faded, but the words still lingered. Holmes exhaled softly. Reginald Ashford's final move. He held it up to the light, his lips parted, reading the words aloud. "If you're reading this, then I was right. I was always meant to die that night." A chill settled over the room. The fire crackled, yet it did nothing to warm the silence that followed. Watson swallowed, his throat dry. What does it mean? Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the note, his expression unreadable. It means, Watson, that Reginald Ashford did not merely suspect his own murder. He looked up, his grey eyes dark with something I could not name. He foresaw it. Watson felt the weight of the words press upon him. But how? Did he know his brother would betray him? Did he anticipate Henshaw's involvement? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the paper drift onto the desk. The ink had bled into the fibres over time, but the final line remained clear. The pieces were already set. The game was never mine to win. A heavy silence filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something in Holmes I had never seen before. Doubt. I had seen Holmes solve countless mysteries, had watched him unravel the most complex webs of deceit with a mind sharper than any blade. But tonight, something was different. I stared at the note on the desk, at the words left behind by a man who had died 2 decades ago, and a thought struck me with unsettling clarity. Holmes, I murmured. We didn't solve this case. He did not respond. I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. We only uncovered what was left behind. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair, his gaze lost in the flickering glow of the fire. Yes, he admitted at last. The game was played long before we arrived. We merely followed its echoes. A cold weight settled in my chest. I had always believed in the pursuit of justice, that no matter how long it took, the truth would bring resolution. But this case had left something behind. A lingering unease, a question without an answer. I watched Holmes closely, waiting for him to say something that would put my mind at ease. He did not. Holmes rose from his chair, moving with slow deliberation toward the fireplace. The old case file sat upon the desk, the faded pages bearing the weight of 20 years. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring down at it. Then, without a word, he lifted the file, his fingers brushing against its worn edges, and tossed it into the flames. The fire consumed it instantly, the parchment curling, blackening, turning to ash. Watson opened his mouth to protest, but then he stopped. Holmes's face was unreadable, his expression carved from stone. Yet, in the glow of the dying embers, there was something almost resigned in his eyes. "The past is done, Watson," he said quietly. "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed." Watson exhaled, watching as the last remnants of the case dissolved into nothing. And yet, even as the fire burned low and the night stretched on, he could not shake the feeling. The game was never truly over.